Looking back, I feel dumb. Completely stupid, actually. I should have known that apartment was far too cheap to be right, even for a studio. I should have known there had to be a catch. The day I moved in was a complete blur. I insisted that no one help me, not wanting to prove any of my family members' suspicions about my character. By late afternoon, all my muscles ached terribly and my head throbbed. I fell back on my bare mattress, staring up at the ceiling fan with glazed over eyes. I pulled the damp strands of hair from my sweaty forehead, wincing in disgust. Someone knocked on my door, causing me to jump. I cursed under my breath, pushing myself up onto my elbows. Two girls were peeking around my doorframe. Foolishly, I had left it wide open, forgetting the old college rule: only leave your door open if you want to make new friends. And I was not in the mood to make new friends. One of them, an Asian girl with choppy black hair, was grinning at me. The other stood a little further back, fingering a box of Marlboro Reds. "Hey," she said, nodding at me. Her voice was smooth and raspy at the same time. "Did you just move in?" I laid back, rubbing my face with both hands, choosing not to bother with manners. "Yeah, about 5 seconds ago." The girls walk in, evidently ignoring my very clear body language. The girl with the black hair ran her fingers along the edge of my desk and then picked up a little ceramic duck from my unpacked box of trinkets. "Grandma," I explained, feeling strangely defensive. "Cute," she replied, holding it up to her face. "Has anyone told you yet?" the other girl asked abruptly, looking around my apartment. She had tucked the cigarettes into the back pocket of her jeans and was now tugging at her long red braids. "Jesus, Gianna, give her a second." "Well, she needs to know." "Yeah, but we haven't even asked her name." I blinked at the two strangers incredulously. I haven't even had time to put toilet paper in my bathroom, and here they are, touching my things and talking about me like I wasn't there. I just wanted to take a nap, honestly. "My name's Arden," I said. The girl with the red braids, Gianna, sat down next to me on my bed. "Did they tell you?" "Tell me what?" "Oh, of course they didn't. The rules." I blinked again, my face blank. I didn't know about any rules, besides the typical renting ones. I had signed the lease after, at best, skimming over it. The landlord was a skinny woman who smelled of ashes, and I was fairly certain she had never developed the facial muscles necessary for smiling. I wasn't about to ask her any follow-up questions, especially when the rent was so cheap. The other girl laughed nervously. "Where did you move from?" I ignored her. "What rules?" Gianna got a strange, wicked sort of smile on her face, bouncing a little on my mattress. The other girl sighed loudly. "Something happens here every night," she began, pulling out my rickety office chair and sitting down. "Something weird." "Like what?" I sat up, frowning at her. Finally, my interest was piqued. "Someone walks down the street," Gianna said, her voice reminding me of a camp counselor telling a scary story around the bonfire. "That one, right down there," she pointed at my window. "It's someone different each night. They scream for help for about an hour, but we aren't supposed to help them." I just stared at her. I felt a small chill run up my spine. I didn't know what to make of all this. "It happens at a different time every night," the other one said softly. "We never know when it's coming." "Why?" She shrugged almost sadly. "We don't know why." I scoffed, leaning my elbows against my knees. "I don't believe you." The girl shrugged. "You don't have to. You'll see for yourself." The look in her eyes made me want to believe her. She seemed sincere, but I couldn't even begin to fathom what they were saying to be true. It was too strange, too outlandish. I knew this wouldn't be the nicest neighborhood, but it couldn't be that bad. It had to be a prank. They had to be hazing me or something. "We'll come back later," Gianna said matter-of-factly. "We'll show you." Before I could protest, she grabbed the other girl by the wrist, and they were gone. I followed them to the door, watching them march down the hall, talking to each other in hushed voices. I closed my door behind them. That night, as promised, they came back. They came dragging along two boys. One was somewhat muscular, wearing a tight black t-shirt and baggy jeans, and my eyes were instantly drawn to a silver heart-shaped locket around his neck. He smiled at me and introduced himself as Will when he walked in. The other boy was smaller, but chubbier, and a bit nervous-looking, with a buzz cut and ill-fitting cargo shorts. His name, I was told, was Mateo. The girl named Gianna came in carrying a bottle of wine and that same slightly crumpled box of cigarettes. The other one, the girl I still don't know the name of, was the only one who looked even somewhat apologetic. They all sat down on my dusty floor next to the window and motioned for me to join them. I sat between Will and the nameless girl, unsure whether I should continue feeling violated or if I should just give in to my strange, pushy neighbors. "Do you all live in this building?" I asked, hesitantly accepting the wine when it was passed to me. "Yeah," Will answered with a grin. It seemed half-hearted. "This building is where all the young people live." "It's where they put us," Gianna cut in, lighting a cigarette. It didn't even occur to me to tell her not to smoke inside. "We've all been sorted out. Forgive her. She's a bit of a conspiracy theorist." "It's not a theory," she snapped, glaring at him. "Look at the other ones, next door, the middle-agers, people with kids, but no grandkids. Across the street, old people. Not a single 20-something in that entire building. May, tell them." So her name was May. I looked her over, admiring her smoky eye makeup and how she tied her hair up, her long strands poking out like exploding fireworks. "Stop it," May muttered, reaching for the wine bottle. "You'll scare her." "I'm not scared." She just shrugged at me as if she didn't believe me. We passed the bottle around and then around again. I listened to them bicker and laugh. It was clear they'd all been friends for a while, and I felt a little bit like I was intruding, even though they were in my apartment. Will asked me if I had gone to college, and I told him I did, but I dropped out. They all nodded sympathetically, which made me feel stupid. By midnight, I was a little bit buzzed, and my guard was beginning to fall. I had to admit, it felt good to have friends. I had already mentally resigned myself to a life of solitude, at least for a while, but it seemed that might not actually have to be my fate. I laughed at Mateo and Gianna's drunken argument, passing a cigarette back and forth with May, blowing the smoke out of my open window. I had almost completely forgotten why they were all over when it happened. All at once, a blaring alarm came from each of our phones like an Amber Alert. I could hear the sound echo throughout the neighborhood, like an entire chorus of hundreds of phones going off, not just ours. I nearly leapt out of my skin. Not even Gianna laughed. All of them went quiet, and they looked at me as I took it out, frowning at the screen. This is what it said. "Do not interfere." "It's coming," Will whispered. He had changed, his eyes almost glassy and his voice soft and shaky. Mateo squeezed his shoulder. I looked at May. Her eyebrows were cinched together in concern, and she was stubbing out her cigarette against the windowsill, shrinking away. There it was again, that chill. It crept up my back, spreading along my scalp and making me shiver. Something felt deeply, deeply wrong. The others were quiet now, staring silently at the window I was sitting up against. The air felt somehow warmer, like it was buzzing with something, or maybe I was just sweating. We sat there, unmoving, for what felt like an hour. Right as I was getting tempted to ask what was going on, I heard it. It was far away and faint, but I still heard it, a cry. It continued as it got gradually closer, louder, and more desperate.
"Help. Please. My God, someone help me."
Slowly, I leaned out the window. I had to see it with my eyes. Had to confirm there was actually someone out there like they had said there would be. My new apartment was on the 4th floor, so it was hard to see who was down on the street without squinting. In the flickering streetlight, I could make out the outline of an elderly man. He was hunched over, wandering aimlessly from door to door, wearing only what looked like a hospital gown to cover his pale, broken body. Behind him trailed a path of dripping blood, although I couldn't see where it was coming from.
"Please, I'm hurt."
I looked back at the others, my mouth hanging open. "What is this?" I demanded loudly. "What the hell is this?" May touched my arm, trying to calm me down. I pulled away from her. Arden, please. We have to help him. Why can't we help him? He's just an old man. We can't help him. Trust me. I ignored her, leaning further out the window, prepared to call out to him. Before I could open my mouth, I froze. The man down there was still now, facing our building. His head was tilted upwards, and I couldn't see his eyes, but I knew he was looking right at me. I immediately felt cold, like I was plummeting into ice water.
Help me?
He whimpered into the silent night air, his voice barely audible. Then he began to scream. That scream wasn't human, or at least not any human I had ever met. It was desperate, agonized. It made my stomach turn and my eyes prick with tears. I couldn't look away. The blood was coming from his arms, or should I say, his lack of arms. Where his arms should have been, there was only a bloody, mangled stump. They looked fresh. He didn't move other than a shaky sway, and his eyes didn't leave me. His shriek slowly molded into words that could just barely be understood.
Please, 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 please.
May yanked me backwards, away from the window. I landed on my ass and yelped in pain and horror. What is that thing? I whispered. I didn't mean to whisper, but that was all that came out. We don't know, May replied, her eyes trained on Will, who was crying now. Mateo held on to him like he might topple over. We just know to follow the rules. What happens if you don't follow the rules? I asked, and immediately regretted it. Will sobbed softly. Outside, the old man wailed. Gianna reached over and pulled the window shut, but it somehow did nothing to muffle the blood-curdling sound. Do you want to tell her, or should I? Mateo asked Will. Will just shook his head. He was clutching his locket now, turning the little heart over between his fingers. Mateo sighed and turned towards me. A couple of months ago, one of them got to Will's girl, Shannon. Gianna butted in. Her name was Shannon. Sorry, her name is Shannon. I swallowed, but whatever I did, nothing would force down the lump in my throat. What happened? Mateo shook his head. We don't know. We were all together when the screaming started. Usually we just ignore it now, you know? No use in dwelling on it, but that night, we think she saw something different. She started insisting she had to help, and she ran outside. We couldn't stop her. He paused, glancing over at Will. He was silent and still. The screaming outside had begun to pass, getting softer as it continued further down the street. Then what? He shrugged. Nothing. She was just gone. I pressed my lips together, trying to process all of this. I really had believed they were messing with me, but I had seen it. I had witnessed it firsthand, and it terrified me. Why doesn't anyone leave? He shrugged for a second time. Can't afford it, or people just don't care. Some people have left, but we all signed an NDA with the lease, so nobody ever knows. I frowned, thinking back to signing the paperwork, trying to remember. I could vaguely picture what he was talking about. I had just assumed it was more legal jargon that I would never understand. Had I seriously signed a non-disclosure agreement without even noticing? After that, I told them I wanted to go to bed. I needed time to process all of this. They understood, and each one of them said goodbye before leaving me alone. As I lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling, for some strange reason, I thought of May's face when we had realized it was happening. How she'd put out the cigarette and backed away from the window. Eventually, I was able to drift off to sleep. The next few weeks were difficult. I spent more and more time with my new friends. I came to find that they were right. I didn't think there was a single person older than 30 in our entire building, but I did see them all the time leaving from the one next door. Settling in was difficult. The others seemed so used to it. They cared, of course. It scared them, especially Will. But you could tell that they had been here a while by the way they sighed, closing the blinds and focusing harder on whatever they were doing. Eventually, I began to mimic them. It helped a little bit to pretend it was normal, as strange as that sounds. Moving out wasn't really an option for me anyways. I was a college dropout, and I hadn't found a job yet. I was still just getting by on what I had managed to save up. Every night, it was someone different. Some were more human, some seemed less. Some were drenched in blood, their clothes ripped and strange, but some looked fairly normal. The worst were the children. They would run like injured chickens, screeching and banging on doors, begging for help. Sometimes they would try different things, say different things, like, "They're coming," or "I don't want to die," or even, "I'm sorry." There were a lot of children. One night, while I was half awake, an alarm went off. It wasn't like the one on our phones. It was blaring, only somewhat muffled by the window. My apartment glowed a flashing red from outside. I didn't even look. I was too scared of what I might see. I just covered my head with my pillow and tried to fall back to sleep. I came to learn of all the theories, especially from Gianna. She thought we had all been chosen and predetermined to live here, all for some sick little government game. She thought maybe there were people betting on the different buildings, putting down money on who would interfere the least. "See that?" she said to me one day in the hallway, returning from a coffee run. "Cameras everywhere." I didn't know if I believed her. I spent time with May mostly. We smoked on the front steps and people watched. It was strange to see what at night was such a sinister and gruesome neighborhood during the day, bright and lively. She didn't talk much about the rules, so I didn't either. We didn't talk all that much in general, I found, just enjoying each other's company. Right when I was beginning to feel comfortable was when it happened. It started with a birthday cake. "Happy birthday!" As May walked through the door, Mateo blew into his plastic party horn. The paper inflated, smacking Will on the side of the head. May's hand flew to her heart. "Jesus Christ, you fuckers know I hate surprises." Gianna laughed and walked over to her. In her hands, she held a chocolate cake, haphazardly adorned with sprinkles and bright pink icing that read, "Happy birthday, May," in the center. 24. She sat the cake down on the dresser and threw her arms around May's neck. "How does it feel?" "Fucking awful." "That's the spirit." "Enough of this," Mateo cut in, weaving between them. "Let's eat some cake, then let's go." Their tradition, I had learned, was to bar hop for birthdays. They told me there was no curfew here despite the rules, just a recommended time to be home, which was 10:30 p.m. Usually, they said, they got home before the alarm or spent the night somewhere else. We all took some cake. The boys took shots in the kitchen to pregame, while I watched Gianna fuss over May's hair. I was never much of a partier. While at clubs or bars in college, I spent most of the time out back chatting with the smokers. But then again, I was never much of a friend group person either, so maybe the circumstances were changing. I watched them all troop outside to Mateo's car. I stuffed myself in the back, incredibly conscious of how close I was pressed into May. My other shoulder rammed into the car door. Mateo's music, cranked up to maximum volume, hurt my ears, and the tiny space was packed with the smell of tobacco and various perfumes as we sped down the freeway toward the city. But it was nice. It was really nice. I found myself laughing with them, and I hooked my arm around May's when she weaseled her hand beneath my elbow. It was actually nice. As predicted, the bars they chose weren't exactly my scene, but this time, as opposed to college, I could stand it. I took shots. I followed them out for smoke breaks. I even danced under the low purple lights until my feet ached inside my chunky heels, surely riddled with blisters. By the time we got to our third bar, I couldn't even feel it anymore. It was at the third bar that we were crammed into an old photo booth, and Gianna reluctantly offered $5 to the slot, and we laughed, red-faced, into a tiny camera. After the photos spit out into the compartment, the others slid through the red curtains. But before I could follow, May grabbed my wrist. She held me back, sliding her long baby blue nails up my wrist. I shivered. "You never gave me a birthday present," she whispered, and I could feel her breath on my face. If I was wearing my glasses, they would have been fogging up. "Yeah, well, I didn't get to finish my quip before she kissed me. It was nice. And then it wasn't." "Hey," Will called out to me, squeezing through a crowd of men wearing tattered leather jackets to get me. "Arden, where's everybody else?" I blinked, looking around. I could have sworn they had been right there a second ago, but now none of them were anywhere to be found. I shrugged. Don't know. Why? What's up? He finally broke free from the swaying mass, and I got a better look at him. He looked worried. His face was flushed, and I could see a few drops of sweat creeping out from his hairline. He took his phone out of his pocket and held it out to me. First, I saw his home screen. It was him next to a girl with strawberry blonde hair, both clutching beer bottles and grinning widely at the camera. Then I looked where he actually wanted me to. The time, 1:47 a.m. It's getting late, he narrated. Can we find the others and get going? I understood then. He was worried. It was past 1 a.m. and no alarm yet. It was later than usual. The bars would start closing soon. He wanted to get back before it happened. Will and I weaved through the crowd. I was pretty buzzed, and I realized I was having a hard time moving my feet right, which made me feel embarrassed. I hadn't even had that much to drink. Was I that much of a lightweight? We found them outside, chain-smoking. Will explained the situation while I swayed. The drive back was strangely tense. Mateo's music was turned down, and there wasn't any joking or boisterous gossiping like there had been on the way out. We all felt it. It didn't need to be said. Something was off. Will drove fast, almost reckless, in the dark. May took my hand. Just as he was careening around the last corner, and we could almost make out the shape of our apartment building down the street, it happened. All of our phones went off at once. Gianna let out a small shriek from the other side of the back seat. Do not interfere. Mateo turned backwards to us, pressing his finger to his lips. Had this ever happened before? By their reactions, I didn't think so. It was different when it came, when I was in my bedroom, when I could just shut the curtains and put my headphones on. I felt so small and helpless then, like I was gazing into the maw of something incomprehensibly beyond my understanding. I felt like we were all flies, and this neighborhood, right now, was the spider's web. Will drove slowly now, maybe 5 miles an hour. We were all still, we were all silent. Not even a stray breath cut through the quiet. Underneath the glowing streetlights, I could make out the side of Will's face. He was pale, and if I hadn't seen his knees shifting as he pressed down on the brakes, I could have mistaken him for a mannequin. The car came to a stop. I followed his gaze all the way down the street to the dark horizon, and I saw what he saw. A silhouette. It was far too distant to make out what shape it took, but it was evidently human. It moved in a shaky stumble, limping down the middle of the road in our direction, and in the overwhelming silence I could hear it, far away but still deeply urgent.
Help me.
Will, Gianna hissed, turn the car around. Will didn't move. He just stared forward as white as paper. It didn't make any logical sense, but I knew what he knew. It was too late. There was no use.
Help me. Please help.
I could tell now that it was a girl from its voice, and its figure as it got closer. It was wearing some sort of white nightgown, not unlike the old man's hospital attire from the first night, stained with dark red blood. From here, I couldn't tell if it was fresh or dry. I didn't know why that mattered to me. Maybe, May whispered. Her arm shook against mine. Maybe, if we're quiet and we duck down, it won't see us. Deep down, it felt as hopeless as turning around had felt, but it seemed reasonable. I nodded and did as she suggested, crouching behind the passenger seat, my knees throbbing from the strange angle I'd bent myself into. We all did it, except for Will. He didn't move. He still just looked. When he finally spoke, I could barely hear him. It was so weak. Shannon. The word hung in the air, heavy with implication. Mateo was the one to break the silence. What? Shannon, he repeated, finally turning to look at his friend. That's Shannon. I peered over the seat in front of me, squinting my eyes. The human-like thing was getting closer, and now I could make out strawberry blonde hair, round face, short legs. The girl from Will's phone lock screen. The girl who had disappeared. Shannon. May gasped next to me. Dude, Mateo said slowly, his words crumbling as soon as they left his mouth. I know what you're thinking. Dude, do not get out of the car. Will didn't even seem like he was with us anymore. He was in shock, I think now, looking back. "I have to help her," he insisted, right as another sickening cry rang out.
Help me, help me, help me, please, someone. It hurts.
It was getting far too close for comfort, but it still didn't seem to notice the car. Its cries became more and more desperate as they got louder. "I have to help her," Will repeated, and a bit of life returned to his face. Mateo shook his head and grabbed at his sleeve. "Will, that's not Shannon." Will glared at him, his eyes shining with tears. "I know Shannon. That's her. I know you do, dude, and I know you miss her, but please don't do this." Their voices were getting louder and more distraught, and I felt May press into my side, trembling like a leaf. Gianna was whimpering, but I couldn't see her from my position. The thing was almost to our car when it stopped. She turned her head, left, then right, almost like she was sniffing the air. The boys stopped arguing. I felt like my heart would burst out of my chest. I could see Shannon's face now, and I realized why she hadn't seen us. The girl's face was streaked with gore, and it looked like her eyes had been scooped out with a melon scoop. She cried, drool pouring from her slackened mouth, but no tears could come. It happened too quickly. None of us could stop him. Will violently ripped his arm away from Mateo, fumbling for the handle to the car door. Gianna screamed. Mateo tried to slam down on the lock, but he missed, and Will managed to get the door open before he could try it again. He stumbled onto the asphalt and hit the ground with a soft crunch. The thing turned her head and began to scream. But instead of charging at Will, she backed away. She held her arms out in front of her, like something might attack her, whipping her head around wildly. An alarm went off like the one I had heard. An alarm went off like the one I had heard that one night, but far more unbearable now that I was in it. The streetlights lining either side of the street switched to a flashing red, and Mateo threw himself into the driver's seat, the tires screeching as he peeled away. Gianna was screaming at him, pleading with him to go back. May was weeping into her hands. I didn't move, didn't make a sound. I didn't understand. As we sped away, I looked back. I couldn't help it. I saw the flash of some sort of van and the blinding red light pulling around the corner. Then nothing. That was a week or two ago. I don't know. I've been having a hard time keeping track of time. None of us have spoken much since that night. We tried the police, of course, but as you could assume, nothing came of it. I think whatever this is far larger than we know. I don't know if it's some kind of experiment or just a sick game, but I'm going to move back into my parents' house next week, despite their berating, and then figure out what to do from there. I don't know if that was really Shannon that we saw that night, or if it was something else, and I don't know which is worse. All I know is that last night, I heard Will's voice outside my window, crying, pleading for help, and I didn't interfere. Hi everyone. I'm shaking and panicking uncontrollably. So this started happening about 4 hours ago, and I finally gotten home, so I want to write it all down while it's still fresh in my mind. To give a complete rundown, I live in Ontario, Canada, close to Toronto. I heard on the news that tonight there would be a chance to see the Northern Lights again. This past May, I went and saw them and wanted to take the opportunity to see them again. Last May, I went with a couple buddies, but no one was available this time. The plan was to drive 4 hours to Algonquin Park, hike in the middle of the forest, make a campfire, smoke some marbles, and drive back after stargazing. I ended up driving about 2 hours there before my friend sends me a text showing me there's no real forecast for the Northern Lights, so I decided to go up anyway and stargaze, a hobby of mine. I drive up another hour, and at this point it's about 11 p.m. in the middle of nowhere, no signs of humans other than the road and the pitch black. I was once on a call with my buddy since I was pretty boring driving up and started mentioning how beautiful the stars looked. My buddy then recommended that I pull over and take some pictures to send. I end up pulling over, turning off all the lights in my car, while leaving it running, of course, and standing beside the forest. For about 5 minutes, everything was fine as I was admiring the stars, gushing to him about it. Right about that time, the forest went completely quiet. There was literally zero sound other than the wind and the trees. I immediately felt like something was wrong. and went to grab my flashlight to see if there was a bear or something. I walk a little bit into the woods and turn on my flashlight. I end up hearing a rustling noise and turn around until I see this thing standing on its hind legs with a bright orange-red glow to its eyes. It was about 50 meters away. I start mentioning what I'm seeing to my buddy when all of a sudden my signal goes dead before I stare at it for a second until it starts sprinting at me, full speed. I immediately go into fight or flight and dash to my car, going in and redlining it until I'm doing about 300 kilometers an hour. I'm usually a pretty casual guy and not spooked by much, but I was shaking, crying and sobbing, trying not to run away as fast as I could. Before anyone says anything, it wasn't a bear or anything similar. I start spam calling everyone and anyone I can until I get a hold of my best friend and start crying and sobbing about what happened while freaking out. At this point, he just wants to check in to see if I'm okay and whatnot. I start describing to him what I saw, and I use the name of the subreddit. I don't want to say it, even in text, to describe what I saw. It was this super unnatural looking thing, and it had really spooked me. Right around here is when I feel all the muscles in my body start becoming sore and cramping up. It turned out when I had initially dashed to my car, I basically output all the force I could to get away. I'm an ex-rugby player / powerlifter, so my instincts were forcibly making me get out as fast as possible. After about 30 seconds of saying the name, I see the same figure on the side of the road following me with its head and glowing eyes. I proceed to hyperventilate and freak out more until he calms me down and tells me to get the fuck out of there. I started looking for a way to make a U-turn, but couldn't find anything. At this point, I drive another 15 minutes before I can find somewhere to turn without stopping. I start to slow down and U-turn before I hear this ear-splitting screaming sound from my window before I gun it back in the direction I came. I start freaking out more, telling my friend as everything was happening before I started getting a sinking feeling in my stomach that something was watching me. I start to look all over the empty roads and see nothing. All of a sudden, my signal goes out again, and I hear the screaming sound, and I see a kinda humanoid body in the fetal position on the side of the road. I then see its head look up and stare at me directly. I gun it again and can't get the goosebumps and sinking feeling to stop. I continue trying to contact everyone I can to no avail. I end up trying to calm myself down with my Kanye CD and hear something tapping my sunroof. I don't know how I knew, but I knew something wanted me to open the sunroof. I prevailed and never looked, but I never lost that sinking feeling that it was there. I would hear the tapping sound on and off, rhythmically, kinda like drums, for about an hour until I reached a small town. At this point, I've gotten a hold of my friend and puked in my car. I'm just trying to get back as fast as possible, and he's telling me to describe Elden Ring lore to him to calm me down. After about an hour of paranoia, I stop crying and freaking out. I drive as fast as possible to get home, but I can't shake that feeling that there's still something there. I've locked all my doors and windows, and I'm still shaking like crazy. I don't know what to do, and I'm freaking out. Update. I can't stop shaking, and the sinking feeling is still there. I can't stop checking the windows every 5 seconds. Final update. Thanks for all the advice and kind words. Just wanted to say I'm alright. I've definitely calmed down a bunch, and I'm safe now. I got motion detected cameras surrounding the house that activate a light when anything is detected, so I'm pretty sure I'm fine now. The plan is to stay awake all through the night and basically sleep in the morning. There was a body under my bed, and no one believed me. I was 12 when it happened. While taking inventory of my marble collection, my tiger's eye rolled underneath my bed. Without a second thought, I reached under and felt around. That's when my hand touched hers. At 12, the only hands I had ever held were those of my parents when I was little. Right away, I knew what it was when those cold appendages met mine. I recoiled my hand and backed into the adjacent corner of my room. Once I calmed down, I got on all fours and lowered my face to the floor. The last thing I remembered were those eyes. The most intense blue eyes I had ever seen, even to this day. The next thing I knew, I was waking to the concerned faces of my parents standing over me. My sister, Jill, relayed the message that I released a blood-curdling scream and passed out right after. Not long after I came to, the memory of what triggered the episode came flooding back. I proclaimed that there was a body under my bed, and of course, like the majority would, my parents thought I was full of shit. They said it was just a bad dream. It's just your imagination. But I was adamant and persistent. They had no choice but to investigate. I sat and waited, huddled on the couch. I covered my ears and closed my eyes to prepare for the scream that I knew would come from my mother. When it didn't come, I held my breath and cracked my lids just enough to see my parents standing before me again. Their expressions were less that of concern and more of annoyance. They scolded me for playing such a silly prank, and that was it. My parents were of the no-nonsense variety, especially my dad. Their irritation with the situation made me question if I truly saw what I saw. For the rest of that evening into the night, I avoided my room. Once bedtime came, I wanted to protest, but the look my father gave me spoke louder than words. With shaky legs and shallow breaths, I stepped forward into my room. Everything looked normal, felt normal. It even smelled normal. Relief and a healthy dose of exhaustion from the day's events washed over me. I hurriedly changed into my pajamas and got snuggled into bed. Sleep came to me easier than expected, however. It was not a restful sleep. The nightmares kept me tossing and turning all night. Those damn blue eyes were on the face of everyone I saw. I ran, slow-motion dream style, through crowds of people grabbing and pulling at my limbs and clothing. They seemed to be pleading with me for something. I jolted awake, unsure of what time it could have been. The sun hadn't risen yet, so I knew it was still early. I felt a sense of unease in the atmosphere. I knew I had to eventually look again. Better sooner rather than later, I thought. I opened the drawer on my bedside table and felt around until the familiar shape of my flashlight grazed my fingertips. I gave it a good smack with my palm before turning it on, after giving myself a mental pep talk in which I concluded that none of this was real. I crawled off my bed and onto the floor. I didn't scream this time, or pass out. I just stared in shock and utter disbelief. There she was. The same blue-eyed woman that was the cause of my insomnia that night and for many more nights to come. Her body was bloodied and contorted in such a gruesome way, but it was the look of fear and helplessness in her expression that truly bonded me to my spot. Part of me expected this apparition to rapidly cover the short distance between us and consume me like in the scary movies. But she didn't move, blink, or give any indication of life. My stupor finally wore off and I silently crawled back into my bed. I cried myself to sleep, asking the universe, why me? And trying to understand how I was going to fix this. Later that morning, I awoke crusty-eyed and groggy from the crying and lack of sleep. Upon entering the kitchen, I greeted my family, and my mother replied, with her back to me, still cooking breakfast. It wasn't until my father loudly inquired about what the hell happened to my face that I became the focus of attention. My mother made comments about my crusty, puffy eyelids, while Jill lovingly compared my appearance to that of fecal matter, which earned a very stern glance from our father. Without thought, I explained that it was the woman under my bed. Before I could go into any further detail, my father briskly cut me off. My father was a harsh man who didn't like to be challenged. Once he had closed the case, there was no appeal. He dealt me some choice words and made it clear that this nonsense prank I was pulling was to end and end immediately. I don't believe any other words were spoken that morning in our entire house. Everyone just quietly played their roles and went about our days. But while I knew better than to utter another word on the subject in the presence of my father, school was a different matter. Joey, my best friend and confidant, believed me without hesitation, and the brainstorming session was on. "She's got to be like some sort of ghost," Joey said while rubbing his non-existent beard. I had known Joey since kinder, and even at the ripe age of 5, he was a supernatural enthusiast. "But I could feel her hand," I replied. He proceeded to explain how not all apparitions are some haunting, ghostly mist. I still didn't understand, but I was willing to accept any explanation more substantial than hallucinations. We, mostly Joey, concluded that she was a lost soul who was stuck on this plane. Why she chose me to appear to, we didn't know. My biggest issues at the time revolved around Pokemon trading cards and video games. I wasn't equipped to help navigate a ghost towards the light, or whatever it was she needed help with. That would not only require mustering the strength to look again, but also finding some kind of way to communicate with her. Should I call a priest or get a Ouija board? Would my parents even allow that? All those thoughts, questions, and more continued to rattle through my brain for the rest of the day. Upon arriving home from school, the silence of our empty house was deafening. I was usually the first one home as both my parents worked until the evening, and my sister had cheerleader practice. My usual after-school routine consisted of having a snack while watching TV for about 30 minutes, then straight to homework. It, as well as my daily chores, were expected to be done by the time my parents arrived home. And believe me, Dad was going to check, but today I was on a mission. I would have plenty of time for those later. I walked into my room and stood by my bed with all the confidence I could find. I had to figure out what the ghost wanted. I had to help her. After counting down from 10, I dropped to the ground and peered under my bed. In an instant, all the bravado I had moments before was gone. My ghost was still there in the same contorted position with the same look of shock and sadness, but her skin had started to dull and turn this sickly gray color. In some places it had begun to sag and droop, giving the impression that it was going to literally fall off the bone. But it was taut and stretched in others, more specifically on her face, which gave her a gaunt skeletal appearance. I didn't know much about death at that age, but I had found enough dead animals in the woods to know that this was a look of decay. It wasn't much longer after this realization that its sickly sweet smell hit my nostrils. I dashed to the bathroom, barely clearing the toilet before my lunch reemerged. By the time my sister got home, I had managed to clean up any remnants of my little episode, but that was about all I had accomplished. She immediately questioned me as to why none of my chores were done. "You know, Dad is going to lose his shit," she said. And I knew she was right. But I couldn't even go into the bathroom without gagging. It's like the sight of that decaying specter unlocked the smell, and now it was permeating every inch of my room. After explaining how the situation had worsened, I could see the annoyance all over Jill's face. With an exasperated but gentle tone, she said she was going to prove to me once and for all that this was all in my head. She stood and made a beeline for the closed door. I sprinted in front of her and barricaded the door with my arms spread wide. I begged her to leave it shut. The door was barely keeping the stench at bay. I didn't understand how she couldn't smell it, as the odor was still slowly seeping through the small gap at the bottom. My sister hesitated, and at that moment I could see her irritation turn to concern. Without another word, she walked away. My parents arrived home together sometime after 6. We technically didn't have a family car, so my dad would use his work truck to drop off and pick up my mom on his way to and from. Occasionally, he had far-off jobs, and Mom would catch rides home from coworkers. Those work trips were a blessing to the rest of us, as it meant we would have a few days without tension and chaos. My dad had only been through the door about 30 seconds before his eyes locked onto mine. I swallowed the knot that had formed in my throat the second I heard the car pull into the yard. I tried to get ahead of his anger by word vomiting what was happening and why I had done no chores. I told him about the decaying skin, the horrendous smell, and those ocean blue eyes. In one swift motion, my father grabbed my arm and dragged me to my bedroom door. His mutterings weren't completely audible, but I was able to make out the phrases, "waste of my time," and "idiotic younging." These were probably in his top 5 sayings of his lifetime. With a ferocity that we were unfortunate to see on more than one occasion, he swung my door open, nearly ripping it from the hinges. With one hand still gripping my arm, he used the other to lift my bed frame. Against the wall, he slammed my bed. My dad was a naturally large and strong man. Lifting my bed one-handed was easy on a good day, but when he was enraged, The man probably could move a house. Amongst the violent disarray of my crying and gagging and my father's yelling, I could still see her through my tear-filled eyes, still lying there in her death pose. How could he not see her, smell her? My father pulled me close to his face. He growled through clenched teeth.
If you keep pulling these fucking pranks, there will be a body under this bed, and it will be yours.
The house was quiet the rest of the evening, like it always was after one of my father's extreme outbursts. No one spoke a word for 2 days the first time he broke a television set. My father wasn't exactly what you would call a loving paternal figure. We never had that traditional all-American father-son relationship. From an early age, he had accepted that I didn't possess that same innate aggression as him, and declared me a lost cause. And though the smell radiating from under my bed was insufferable, I knew better than anyone how deep my father's rage could go. The thought of that was a whole lot scarier than that of a dead ghost girl under my bed. I got little to no sleep that night. I spent the first couple of hours or so gagging and fighting back the urge to expel what little food I had in my stomach. Once I had acclimated to the putrid smell, it was the quiet sobbing that kept me from sleeping. I would cry and cry until I eventually fell asleep, only to be plagued by nightmares of the face that lay below me. I would wake soaked in sweat and tears, only to start the whole process all over again. Unfortunately, this was my new normal, tossing and turning, gagging and crying all night, followed by complete exhaustion the next day. The lack of sleep obvious to my family, but no one dared approach the subject, fearing my father's rage. I would occasionally check in on the state of my corpse apparition bunkmate. She continued to disgustingly wither away right before my eyes. I remember thinking I would start to resemble a corpse myself at this rate. And though the sight was gruesome, I had the thought that maybe she would completely decay and dissolve into nothingness. During this time, my nightmares became more vivid. I would see her running in the woods, not jogging, but running in fear. It was like some kind of horror movie. I could feel her fear as she frantically dodged limbs and other forest debris. She would glance back at whoever or whatever she was running from. The look of pure desperation she displayed haunts me more than anything else. The only time I had seen real fear like that before was on TV or in the eyes of my family when my father had one of his more extreme outbursts. It was the fear of knowing something bad was going to happen, and that there was absolutely nothing in this world you could do to stop it. As the nights progressed, so did the dreams. Eventually, her pursuer caught up to her. I will spare you the details of her demise, though it came in the form of a sickening, twisting nightmare. Something told me those scenes were too graphic not to be real. And this woman chose to appear to me? She chose to show me these events? But why? What could I do? I started checking the local news websites to see if anyone who looked like her was missing or murdered, but I found nothing. I had started to think that this whole predicament would end with me withering and perishing away right alongside her. Every day I could see the worry in my mother's eyes, but one sharp glance from my father was enough to make the hardest of men shiver. My mother was a small, meek woman who did what her husband told her, at least to his face. Many nights I was supposed to be deprived of dinner, but she would always manage to sneak me a plate in the wee hours of the morning. She saved me many times in more ways than one. After what felt like years, it all ended on a bright, sunny day. I hadn't checked on my specter in a while. By this point, she wasn't much more than a skeleton. The only thing that seemed to resist death's grip was her face. The blue of those eyes never faded. I prepared myself to see that familiar gaze once again, only to find myself looking at a water bottle, a pair of socks, and a baseball mitt. She was gone. I felt a bit of relief, but I felt sadness more than anything. I knew what I had been seeing and experiencing was real, though I had no proof in those moments. I knew she was real, and I knew what she went through was real. I hurt for her. No human should go through the atrocities this woman suffered. My family was never religious, but in that moment, I prayed that she was at peace. As the day progressed, the immense sadness I felt upon discovering my specter's departure soon began to fade. It was replaced with what can only be described as deep anxiety. I didn't understand why I felt anxious and on edge, especially since it seemed that my ordeal was over. However, shortly after lunch period, my day, my life, rather took a turn I never expected. My principal, Mr. Cash, came to retrieve me from my classroom with no disclaimer as to what prompted the trip to the office. I wasn't an angel by any means, but I had managed to never land myself in the hot seat, not even once. During the definitely quiet 2-minute walk, I tried to recall anything I could have done to get myself in trouble. It wasn't until he opened the door and I saw the worried face of my sister that I knew the trouble didn't lie with me. Our principal, who was normally a cheerful man, wore an expression that told me no good news was to come from there. Our principal, who was normally a cheerful man, wore an expression that told me no good news would come from here on out. He informed us that there had been an incident, and our aunt was on her way to pick us up. Jill instantly began to weep. I didn't grasp what was happening. Why weren't our parents coming to get us? Where were they? Was Mom hurt? Did my dad hurt her? Mr. Cash stood up and began to walk towards his office door. He paused beside me momentarily and placed his hand on my shoulder. Without another word, he left us to wait. In between my sister's low sobs, I could hear my heart pounding. The thumping seemed to grow louder as each agonizing second ticked on. It then transitioned to a ringing in my ears. As the ringing was about to reach a fever pitch, the door swung open, revealing my aunt. My aunt wouldn't tell us much. She confirmed that, while our parents weren't hurt, there was an incident, and my mother, my sister, and I would be staying with her for a bit. This statement unleashed a whole new round of questioning. Despite our persistence, our aunt made it clear that my mother had all the answers. Upon arriving at our aunt's house, we found our mother sitting blank-faced and stoic on the couch. You could tell from the puffiness and redness of her eyes that she had been weeping. She immediately outstretched her arms, and we melted into them. I still didn't know what terrible thing had happened, but I knew I was happy to be in my mother's arms. After our meaningful embrace, my sister and I each took a seat on either side of our mother as she firmly grasped our hands. She solemnly looked from me to my sister before she begun. Your father did a very, very bad thing, and he won't be coming home anytime soon, if ever. She said this as her voice began to crack. She proceeded to reveal to us that our father had murdered a woman a state over while he was on one of his supposed work trips. Mother didn't go into much detail to try to spare us some of the trauma, to prevent us from stumbling upon the gruesome facts of it all. We weren't allowed to watch any of the cable or access the internet. We were told we would be taken the rest of the week off of school, maybe even longer. This would normally be a 12-year-old's dream, but this felt more like a hellscape. That night, after everyone else had made peace with the Sandman, I crept into the living room and tuned into the local news station. It wasn't long before I saw her. Plastered on the screen, dressed in her jet black cap and gown, was my ghost girl. Anna Elizabeth Collins. She was 19, not much older than my sister. Anna had fallen in with the wrong crowd shortly after graduating high school. She often caught rides with strangers as a means of getting around. Her body had been found by some hikers out in the woods. Our father and his work truck fit the description of the man seen giving her a ride. Police followed him for weeks waiting for him to slip up. They retrieved DNA from a cigarette he had tossed on the ground. It was a match, not just for Anna, but for 2 other unsolved missing persons cases. As I stared into those baby blues, I felt tranquility I had never felt before. Though Anna had suffered greatly at the hands of my father, I somehow knew she was at rest now. I turned off the TV and lay on the couch until I drifted off to sleep. That night, there was no gagging, there was no tossing, there was no turning, and there were no nightmares. That night, I dreamt I was standing in the middle of my room. Anna appeared in my doorway, but not as the mangled corpse I was used to, but now It was as she looked in the photos and the videos on the news. Her face was serene and angelic. She glided across the room as the light of her aura filled the entire space around us. She placed a hand on each of my shoulders and gently pulled me into an embrace. I knew that life was going to be very different for my family and me after this, but in that moment, I knew we would eventually be okay.